So, I have an idea. We play Jinteki, we make the runner steal lots of agendas, and then we use Philotic Entanglement to 24/7 flatline them. But wait, you say, wait, what if the runner steals the Philotic Entanglement? Well, I say no, you can't. I say, if you steal the Philotic Entanglement, I'll play Cerebral Cast, I'll slap a tag on you, I'll play Exchange, I'll exchange for the Philotic, and then I will still 24/7 flatline you. What could possibly go wrong? Hey everyone, by the time you're watching this video, I would have already taken this deck to Laurie Buzzapalooza. Shout out to Laurie, who organized this UK tournament for the most consistent and best performing UK players for the year 2016. I'm just gonna bring this because it's a lot of fun and it might get me a few surprise wins. Not planning to do especially well with it, but as you saw in the opening intro, this deck revolves around the combo. So I'm gonna start with standard shell game PE, not too worried about Counter Siphon because I'm up against Smoke, and then I score a Gila Hands, which snipes a Film Critic, so that's huge. Getting rid of Film Critic is very important because that prevents my opponent from dodging PE's ability. So this deck is really all about PE's ability, right? Because you're trying to stockpile a lot of ammo in your opponent's score area. You want them to steal agendas because that charges out your Philotic. So the more they steal, the better. And every one they steal takes 1 net damage because of Personal Evolution's ability. Personal Evolution? Potato Evolution? I prefer potatoes more. Let's call it Potato Evolution for now. So, let's see if we can evolve our potatoes today. Cortex Lock is drawn, and I'm gonna start icing up HQ here. There are a couple of agendas in my hand, and I really should be tossing them out of the table. My opponent is being very conservative with checking remotes, so I think this is where I really should be tossing agendas out in the open. But my opponent doesn't seem to be very interested in running the Fetal, so I'm going to double advance it. It's a win-win for me. Either I score 2 points or they steal and take 3 net damage. Employee Strike comes down on the table though, so my opponent is able to steal it for just 2 net damage. I'm not happy about that. With Employee Strike, which is one of the biggest counters to this deck, Employee Strike neuters PE's ability and makes it very hard for me to throw potatoes at my opponent. So the counter to that is Project Kusanagi. I would be looking for Kusanagi right now. I'm frantically drawing to find the Kusanagi. Double draw with Jackson. And yeah, it's a bit of a tough situation here. I am incentivized to score agendas like Futures now, which will allow me to tilt up the Kusanagi. Actually, I don't even need to tutor it, right? Because by scoring one of those 3-1 agendas, I can remove Employee Strike. However, if I put it out in the open and my opponent runs it, they'll get 1 free agenda point for no net damage. So I don't really want to score 3-1s at this point. That's why I shuffle them back in with Jackson. Notice that I keep Global Food in hand. I want to have 1 agenda in hand at all times because Smoke is more likely to attack R&D than HQ, so agendas tend to be safer in HQ. Here I go for the Cerebral Overwriter that has been sitting in my hand since the beginning of the game, and hoping my opponent would run into it just like they did with the Fetal. Unfortunately, Smoke seems very aware of this and decides to go for R&D instead. With an R&D out and a couple of clone chips, they are pretty confident that they can get through and they want to start charging up the Netmarker. Good option. Blasting through the Yogura and DNA Tracker with just a Houdini and a couple of stealth credits, my opponent is able to get through C2 cards. What will they be? It's a Film Critic, Fetal AI, and a Kusanagi. Oh gosh, I really want that Kusanagi. So, one of the good things about Kusanagi in PE is that it turns off Employee Strike. So it serves as a dual purpose. As a shock in PE, because when my opponent steals it, they will have to take 1 net damage. And to turn off Employee Strike. Of course, in this case, it didn't work out as a shock because my opponent had the E-Strike out. So I'm still waiting to get rid of the E-Strike. Meanwhile, my opponent plays co-reading there. It's not automated on Jinteki.net. Basically, my opponent uses co-reading to install Paperclip from the bin, using Clone Chip to assemble their board. And yeah, that's a pretty good interaction. They don't have to suffer the downside of co-reading because they didn't use any programs that turn. Now, because my opponent ran last turn, I'm going to play Cerebral Cast. Force a brain damage to my opponent. Second Cerebral Cast. My opponent fails the side game again. Are they going to take the second brain damage? Nope, they decide to take the tag instead. So what do I trash here? Ideally, I would use Exchange of Information here, but I don't have it, and my opponent doesn't have very valuable agendas anyway. I could trash the Film Critic, but my opponent will simply run Archives to fetch a Fetal. If I wanted to prevent my opponent from stealing a veto, I needed to have one more click remaining to either install the Jackson from my hand or to use preemptive action. Since I didn't have the extra click, trashing Film Critic was actually not an option. I went for the Netrunner instead, because I knew that stealth credits were going to be my opponent's weak point. If they couldn't find enough stealth credits, they won't be able to bust through my DNA tracker. So that's my intention with that. Of course, my opponent immediately liberates the veto AI off the Film Critic, and that window is closed for me. I'm going to reshuffle stuff back with preemptive action, so I hopefully should get more Cerebral Cast to further my game. Cerebral Cast is really the main linchpin of this deck because it allows me to threaten the kill and the agenda win at the same time. If my opponent takes a tag, I can swap agendas for the win. Unfortunately, tags are now useless because my opponent shows the New Angela City Hall. New Angela City Hall is the hardest counter to my deck. Above all else, it turns off all the Cerebral Casts in my deck. They can choose to take the tag and then avoid it, rendering my cast useless. I top deck the second Kusanagi in this deck, and it's time to score it to turn the potatoes back on. Potatoes off. Employee Strike comes down on the table, the second copy from my opponent, into a safe indexing. Indexing means that my opponent can run with 2 cards in hand and not worry too much. They won't hit a snare, they won't hit a fetal. Fetal won't kill them anyway because they have Employee Strike. So my opponent doesn't have to worry too much at this point. What they do have to worry about, however, is that they don't have any other source of stealth credits, so even if my opponent finds a global food or an agenda on the top of R&D, they can't fetch it. They can only draw cards and hope that the agenda will still be there on the next run. My opponent gives me an exchange of information, interesting stuff there. So I draw 1 card and take 3. Gila Hands is doing a lot of work. I didn't really mention this. I scored it on my second turn and it's been doing crazy amounts of work. With Gila Hands, you get into the regular tempo of take 3, install a card, take 3, install a card, take 3, install a card, and that gets you rich unbelievably fast. It's a very good agenda for recovering from account siphons nowadays, which is quite important. Siphons are everywhere. So yeah, my opponent begins running HQ and I'm in a bit of a pickle. The food is sitting there in my hand. If my opponent steals it, they are on match point. I don't like that. I really need my opponent to steal more agendas. So when I saw the second snare in my hand, I knew that this was a good time to start stocking the snares in my hand so that my opponent would be very afraid of running HQ. This means that I can stash agendas in hand. I still put the food in the bin, however, because I was intent on using my preemptive action. Knowing that I'm going to run out of hand slots soon, I would like to use that preemptive action here. I'm going to advance the Overwriter once again and hope that I can feign a run-in. Since my opponent saw a run-in off the top of my deck, hopefully they'll run it eventually. I'll leave it there. For now, my opponent indexes into double DNA tracker. This is where the Gila Hands money is all coming to play. Gila Hands is giving me so much money that I can actually play semi-glacier style. Don't have to worry about R&D lock because my opponent is spending a lot of credits to get through my entire server. They bankrupted themselves just to pull off this indexing. I'm happy about that. So next turn is probably take 3 of Gila Hands and do something. And I am fairly confident that my opponent won't be able to do much because indexing is very, very painful on my opponent's credit pool. That being said, by controlling my R&D, by digging through so many cards and controlling what I draw off the top, my opponent is actually making it very hard for me to win because he probably knows that agendas won't come into my hand. If they're stealing them from the indexing and giving me all the other cards, I can't win by agendas. So this is why preemptive action is actually kind of important in this deck. I need to reduce the agenda density in R&D and constantly shuffle it up so I can break R&D lock and find the cards I need to win the game. So the card I'm looking for right now is none other than Philotic Entanglement. With my opponent on 4 hand size due to the 1 brain damage, I really want to make a Philotic happen. And ideally that will be done with 4 agendas in my opponent's score area, which is possible. Bringing my opponent up to match point by stealing a 1 or 2 pointer and then landing the Philotic would be my line of play right here. If only I could find a Philotic. And even if my opponent finds it for me, steals it for me, I still have exchange of information to work with. Although that's going to be very hard given that New Angeles is on the board. Now my opponent runs a turn after the indexing, cueing to me that there are agendas on top of R&D that he indexed all the way down. So I used the second Jackson here, did not shuffle anything to my deck, but I did shuffle things up, made sure that they couldn't get the agendas they wanted, stole a futures now to put themselves a match point. There are 2 global foods and 1 fetal AI left in the deck, 3 cards that could lose me the game. That's a worry. So at this point, I don't really know what to do. I play a couple of cards out here, but my opponent doesn't have to check them, do they? Because I haven't been drawing agendas, my opponent has been controlling the top of my R&D. So they know that these are not agendas, there's no need to run them. And sure enough, my opponent doesn't. Smoke just continues setting up her board, getting the money that she needs to lock down R&D. At this point, all I can do is to draw past the R&D lock for a bit and then hit Gila Hands for money. Soon enough, my opponent goes into HQ, suspecting that there might be agendas here, and I wish I didn't put the snare down. I would like to have a lot of snares in my hand right now. Well, my opponent goes for the Netrunner. I draw a Komainu. Komainu is pretty good against my opponent, who is using Dagger instead of Switchblade as the Sentry Breaker. Komainu is going on R&D, and I definitely do have the money to support that. Again, Gila Hand's doing so much work here. I draw into Psychic Field, think about it for a moment, realize that my opponent has not locked down my R&D just yet. That's going in the new remote. Hopefully I can bait a run into the remote. They cold read into R&D. So for those of you who are not familiar with the martial law spoilers, cold reading gives you 4 stealth credits, and it's a run event. After the run event, they have to trash a program that they used during the run. So this run on R&D is going to net my opponent 3 cards off the top. They break through the Komainu and the double DNA tracker, not that very taxing, but enough to force my opponent to not be able to run R&D and lock it every single turn. But seeing 3 cards off the top basically loses me the game, more or less. There are 22 cards in R&D, 3 outs for my opponent, and they get to see 3 of those cards. Pretty good chance right there. And it's at this point that I really wish I had more traps in my deck. All I have left in my deck, nothing actually. There are 2 snares on the board, and 1 snare in my hand. I did not get a chance to reshuffle the snares back in my deck. In retrospect, what I should have done was to override the failed traps at the beginning. Those like Server 2, Server 4, Psychic Fields and Snares, staying on the board the entire game. I should have shuffled them back into R&D to make R&D a bit spikier for when my opponent runs out of indexing, such as this situation here. So yeah, they steal a couple of agendas, but it's not game. Unfortunately, because Employee Strike's active, my opponent stole 2 agendas but didn't take a single net damage. The extra net damage would have been so useful. If you notice, my opponent let me fire Yagura, which was a mistake. I was able to bury the winning global food to the bottom of my deck. I draw another exchange of information. At this point, I don't need that many exchanges. I glance at my opponent's board. They have all the Kusanagis. All I have is one of them with me. So 24/7, or rather exchange for the win is probably not going to work out. What I need to do here is to find a Philotic, score it myself, which should be quite doable given that my opponent's not running my remotes at all. Score Philotic, and then work my way towards 24/7. My opponent is loaded, absolutely loaded with 6 agendas, worth of agendas. So once we get a Philotic, this could easily be game. They have no way to win against the slew of agendas. I find the Cerebral cast and I realize my opponent doesn't have a New Angelus anymore. Because of that R&D run where they stole 2 agendas at one go, they were forced to trash the New Angelus. This gives me a window to play Cerebral cast. I win the side game for the 3rd time. My opponent is forced to take a brain damage or attack. What will they choose? They choose the brain. They are down to 3 hand size. 6 hit points. 3 cards in hand, 3 cards in deck. However, they are on match point, so I have to be really careful right here. I ice HQ here as a trap. I'm trying to tell a story here. I have agendas in hand. I don't want you to steal them because you're on match point. I hope my opponent is baited into running HQ here because there's nothing in HQ other than the snare that would cripple their game. Now at this point, realizing that my opponent only has 4 hit points left between the deck and their hand, I fire the Ronin. Knowing that there are no Deus Ex in the bin, I empty their hand and force them to play the game with the last single card. Where will they find the winning agenda? Is it on the board? Is it in R&D? I think it makes the most sense to run R&D here or to hammer HQ. In this case, my opponent goes for R&D, using Netmerker to draw the final card and breaking through my server. This is do or die. This is game or no game. This is it right here. And unfortunately, my opponent finds the agendas instead. I never really stood a chance at that point anyway, given that my deck was not spiky enough to threaten a flatline. You'd think Smoke would usually be very vulnerable against net damage decks like PE, but turns out my opponent was packing a lot of hate. They had a Film Critic out for most of the game, which negated the damage from Fetal AI. Really, really annoying. Combined with New Angelo City Hall, which disables my main win condition. I wasn't able to it when it was out. I couldn't play Cerebral Cast, and EOI was never online for the whole game. The worst thing that happened to me this game was Employee Strike. After my opponent played the Levy, I was basically committed to milling my opponent out, and that nearly happened. My opponent went down to just one card in deck. Looking back, my opponent stole probably at least 4 or 5 of the 6 agendas with Employee Strike out. Had those steals not have been with Employee Strike out, I would have won the game by milling. So I think this deck definitely needs a way to counter Employee Strike, one of the worst currents to affect this deck. Not to mention the Levy. Some smoke decks don't run Levy, this one does, in response to Potatoes Unleash, and well, it does pretty good work against PA as well. I was not able to chew through my opponent's deck twice. It came very close, but close, so close, yet so far. On the same note, however, I did make quite a bit of misplays, which I think would have swung the game in my favor had I picked up on these during the game. Most importantly, I was not aggressive with 3-1 agendas at all, and this was my biggest downfall. The only way I was able to remove the Employee Strike and continue advancing my win condition was to score 3-1 agendas, but I did not. Why? Because my opponent, because I was very, very afraid my opponent would start running them at some point. I should have picked up on the fact that my opponent was playing very passively on my remotes. I believe he only ran one remote in grand total, that advanced Fetal AI. All other remotes never ran. I should have snipped the Future Is Now and maybe even a House of Knives on the table when I had them in my hand. Instead, I ditched them to Jackson and I never saw them again. As I said during the video, I should have recycled some of the traps that would fail earlier on. The main intention to keep remotes on the board is to threaten the Philotic Flatline. With unadvanced remotes on the board and my opponent having stolen 2 agendas on that big R&D run that got them up to 6 agenda points with 6 agendas in the score area, if I have Philotic on the table, they would have to be very paranoid. They would have to force themselves to run on my remotes to make sure that I wasn't hiding a Philotic, given that it was not seen in any score area yet. So that was the point of keeping unadvanced cards on the table, to force them to run my Psychic Fields and Snares out of paranoia. Of course my opponent didn't fall for that, but on the same token, all I needed was 1 or 2 remotes. After the failed traps have served their purpose, they should be discarded in the bin and recycled with preemptive action. That's the whole reason I ran preemptive action, and I did not fully capitalize on this. As a result, on the final R&D run that lost me the game, there were no snares in my deck. I couldn't threaten the win by flatline. I also should probably have drawn more aggressively and taken less money. Money is always good, especially in a deck like PE, which wants to fire the snares. But given that my opponent wasn't running my snares, given that I was pretty good in terms of money, I really should have spent more time drawing. It's very hard to find a balance between drawing cards and taking money, and I think I fell on the wrong side of the line in this game. Well, you live and learn. In the meantime, thanks everyone for watching, and enjoy your potatoes. See you around.